I told him of the wonders of the lands where the sun dies.
I made him enjoy the sunsets on the Propontis, the emerald glints on the Venetian lagoon, the valley in Hibernia where 7 white churches lie on the shores of a silent lake. I told him how the Alps are covered with a soft white substance that in summer dissolves into majestic cataracts and is dispersed in rivers and streams along slopes rich in chestnut trees. I told him of the salt deserts that extend along the coasts of Apulia. I made him shiver as I described seas I had never sailed, where fish leap as big as calves, so tame that men can ride them. I reported the voyages of St. Brendan to the Isles of the Blessed, and how one day, believing he had reached a land in the midst of the sea, he descended on the back of a whale, which is a fish the size of a mountain, capable of swallowing a whole ship, but I had to explain to him.
I made him enjoy the sunsets on the Propontis, the emerald glints on the Venetian lagoon, the valley in Hibernia where 7 white churches lie on the shores of a silent lake. I told him how the Alps are covered with a soft white substance that in summer dissolves into majestic cataracts and is dispersed in rivers and streams along slopes rich in chestnut trees. I told him of the salt deserts that extend along the coasts of Apulia. I made him shiver as I described seas I had never sailed, where fish leap as big as calves, so tame that men can ride them. I reported the voyages of St. Brendan to the Isles of the Blessed, and how one day, believing he had reached a land in the midst of the sea, he descended on the back of a whale, which is a fish the size of a mountain, capable of swallowing a whole ship, but I had to explain to him what ships were, fish made of wood that cleave the waves, while moving white wings. I listed for him the wondrous animals of my country, the stag, who has 2 great horns in the form of a cross, the stork, who flies from one land to another, and takes care of its own parents when they are old, bearing them on its back through the skies, and the ladybug, which is like a small mushroom, red and dotted with milk-colored spots, the lizard, which is like a crocodile, but so small it can pass beneath a door, the cuckoo, who lays her eggs in the nests of other birds. Tick cataracts and is dispersed in rivers and streams along slopes rich in chestnut trees. I told him of the salt deserts that extend along the coasts of Apulia. I made him shiver as I described seas I had never sailed, where fish leap as big as calves, so tame that men can ride them. I reported the voyages of St. Brendan to the Isles of the Blessed, and how one day, believing he had reached a land in the midst of the sea, he descended on the back of a whale, which is a fish the size of a mountain, capable of swallowing a whole ship, but I had to explain to him what ships were, fish made of wood that cleave the waves, while moving white wings. I listed for him the wondrous animals of my country, the stag, who has 2 great horns in the form of a cross, the stork, who flies from one land to another, and takes care of its own parents when they are old, bearing them on its back through the skies, and the ladybug, which is like a small mushroom, red and dotted with milk-colored spots, the lizard, which is like a crocodile, but so small it can pass beneath a door, the cuckoo, who lays her eggs in the nests of other birds, the owl, whose round eyes in the night seem 2 lamps and who lives eating the oil of lamps in churches, the hedgehog, its back covered with sharp quills who sucks the milk of cows, the oyster, a living jewel box that sometimes produces a dead beauty but of inestimable value, the nightingale that keeps vigil singing and lives worshipping the rose, the lobster, a loricate monster of a flame red color, who flees backwards to escape the hunters who dote on its flesh, the eel, frightful aquatic serpent with a fatty, exquisite flavor, the seagull, that flies. What ships were? Fish made of wood that cleave the waves, while moving white wings. I listed for him the wondrous animals of my country, the stag, who has 2 great horns in the form of a cross, the stork, who flies from one land to another, and takes care of its own parents when they are old, bearing them on its back through the skies, and the ladybug, which is like a small mushroom, red and dotted with milk-colored spots, the lizard, which is like a crocodile, but so small it can pass beneath a door, the cuckoo, who lays her eggs in the nests of other birds, the owl, whose round eyes in the night seem 2 lamps and who lives eating the oil of lamps in churches, the hedgehog, its back covered with sharp quills who sucks the milk of cows, the oyster, a living jewel box that sometimes produces a dead beauty but of inestimable value, the nightingale that keeps vigil singing and lives worshipping the rose, the lobster, a loricate monster of a flame red color, who flees backwards to escape the hunters who dote on its flesh, the eel, frightful aquatic serpent with a fatty, exquisite flavor, the seagull, that flies over the waters as if it were an angel of the Lord, but emits shrill cries like a devil, the blackbird, with yellow beak, that talks like a human, a sycophant repeating the confidences of its master, the swan, that regally parts the water of a lake and sings at the moment of its death a very sweet melody, the weasel, sinuous as a maiden, the falcon that dives on its prey and carries it back to the knight who has trained it, the owl, whose round eyes in the night seem 2 lamps and who lives eating the oil of lamps in churches, the hedgehog, its back covered with sharp quills who sucks the milk of cows, the oyster, a living jewel box that sometimes produces a dead beauty but of inestimable value, the nightingale that keeps vigil singing and lives worshipping the rose, the lobster, a loricate monster of a flame red color, who flees backwards to escape the hunters who dote on its flesh, the eel, frightful aquatic serpent with a fatty, exquisite flavor, the seagull, that flies over the waters as if it were an angel of the Lord, but emits shrill cries like a devil, the blackbird, with yellow beak, that talks like a human, a sycophant repeating the confidences of its master, the swan, that regally parts the water of a lake and sings at the moment of its death a very sweet melody, the weasel, sinuous as a maiden, the falcon that dives on its prey and carries it back to the knight who has trained it.
I imagined the splendor of gems that he had never seen, nor had I, the purplish and milky patches of morine, the flushed and white veins of certain Egyptian stones, the whiteness of orchuk, transparent crystal, brilliant diamond. And then I sang the praises of the splendor of gold, a soft metal that can be transformed into the finest leaf, the hiss of the red-hot slivers when they are plunged into water to be tempered, and the unimaginable reliquaries to be seen in the treasures of the great abbeys, the high and pointed spires of our churches, the high and straight columns of the hippodrome of Constantinople, the books the Jews read, scattered with signs that seem insects. I imagined the splendor of gems that he had never seen, nor had I, the purplish and milky patches of morine, the flushed and white veins of certain Egyptian stones, the whiteness of orchuk, transparent crystal, brilliant diamond. And then I sang the praises of the splendor of gold, a soft metal that can be transformed into the finest leaf, the hiss of the red-hot slivers when they are plunged into water to be tempered, and the unimaginable reliquaries to be seen in the treasures of the great abbeys, the high and pointed spires of our churches, the high and straight columns of the hippodrome of Constantinople, the books the Jews read, scattered with signs that seem insects, and the sounds they produce when they read them, and how a great Christian king had received from a caliph an iron cock that sang alone at every sunrise, then what a sphere is that turns belching steam, and how the mirrors of Archimedes burn, how frightening it is to see a windmill at night. And I told him also of the Grazel, of the knights still searching for it in Brittany, about ourselves and how we would give it to his father as soon as we found the unspeakable Zosimos. Inns of certain Egyptian stones, the whiteness of orchuk, transparent crystal, brilliant diamond, and then I sang the praises of the splendor of gold, a soft metal that can be transformed into the finest leaf, the hiss of the red-hot slivers when they are plunged into water to be tempered, and the unimaginable reliquaries to be seen in the treasures of the great abbeys, the high and pointed spires of our churches, the high and straight columns of the hippodrome of Constantinople, the books the Jews read, scattered with signs that seem insects, and the sounds they produce when they read them, and how a great Christian king had received from a caliph an iron cock that sang alone at every sunrise, then what a sphere is that turns belching steam, and how the mirrors of Archimedes burn, how frightening it is to see a windmill at night, and I told him also of the Grazel, of the knights still searching for it in Brittany, about ourselves and how we would give it to his father as soon as we found the unspeakable Zosimos. Seeing that these splendors fascinated him, but their inaccessibility saddened him, I thought it was good to convince him that his suffering was not the worst, to tell him of the torment of Andronicus with such details that they far surpassed what had been done to him, of the massacres of Crema, of prisoners with a hand, an ear, the nose cut off. I brought before his eyes images of indescribable maladies compared to which leprosy was the lesser evil. I told him how horrendously horrible were scrofula, erysipelas, St. Vitus dance, shingles, the bite of the tarantula, scabies, which makes you scratch your skin, scale by scale, and
Seeing that these splendors fascinated him, but their inaccessibility saddened him, I thought it was good to convince him that his suffering was not the worst, to tell him of the torment of Andronicus with such details that they far surpassed what had been done to him, of the massacres of Crema, of prisoners with a hand, an ear, the nose cut off. I brought before his eyes images of indescribable maladies compared to which leprosy was the lesser evil. I told him how horrendously horrible were scrofula, erysipelas, street vitus, dance, shingles, the bite of the tarantula, scabies, which makes you scratch your skin, scale by scale, and the pestiferous action of the asp, the torture of Saint Agatha, whose breasts were torn away, and that of Saint Lucy, whose eyes were gouged out, and of Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows, of Saint Stephen, his skull shattered by stones, of Saint Lawrence, roasted on a grill over a slow fire. And I invented other saints and other atrocities, such as Saint Ursicinus, impaled from the anus to the mouth, Saint Serapion, flayed, Saint Mopsuestius, his 4 limbs bound to 4 horses, crazed and then quartered, Saint Dracontius, forced to swallow boiling pitch. I thought it was good to convince him that his suffering was not the worst, to tell him of the torment of Andronicus with such details that they far surpassed what had been done to him, of the massacres of Crema, of prisoners with a hand, an ear, the nose cut off. I brought before his eyes images of indescribable maladies compared to which leprosy was the lesser evil. I told him how horrendously horrible were scrofula, erysipelas, street vitus, dance, shingles, the bite of the tarantula, scabies, which makes you scratch your skin, scale by scale, and the pestiferous action of the asp, the torture of Saint Agatha, whose breasts were torn away, and that of Saint Lucy, whose eyes were gouged out, and of Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows, of Saint Stephen, his skull shattered by stones, of Saint Lawrence, roasted on a grill over a slow fire. And I invented other saints and other atrocities, such as Saint Ursicinus, impaled from the anus to the mouth, Saint Serapion, flayed, Saint Mopsuestius, his 4 limbs bound to 4 horses, crazed and then quartered, Saint Dracontius, forced to swallow boiling pitch.
it seemed to me these horrors brought him some relief, but then I feared I had gone too far and I began describing the world's other beauties, often a solace of prisoners' thoughts. The grace of Parisian girls, the lazy opulence of the Venetian prostitutes, the incomparable complexion of an empress, the childish laugh of Calandrina, the eyes of a far-off princess. He became excited, asked me to tell him more, wanted to know what the hair was like of Melisenda, Countess of Tripoli, the lips of those abundant beauties who had enchanted the nights of Broceliande more than the holy Grazel itself. He became excited. God forgive me, I believe that once or twice he had an erection and felt the pleasure of casting his seed. And more, I tried to make him understand how the universe was rich in spices with languid scents, and, since I had none with me, I tried to recall the names of both the spices I had known and those I had only heard of, words that would intoxicate him like perfumes, and for him I listed malabaster, incense, nard, lycium, sandal, saffron, ginger, cardamom, senna, zedoaria, laurel, marjoram, coriander, dill, thyme, clove, sesame, poppy, nutmeg, citronella, curcuma, and cumin. The deacon listened, on the threshold of delirium, touched his face as if his poor nose could not bear all those fragrances. He asked, weeping, what they had given him to eat till now, those accursed eunuchs, on the pretext that he was ill, goat's milk and bread soaked in burk, which they said was good for leprosy, and he spent his days stunned, almost always sleeping and with the same taste in his mouth, day after day. You were hastening his death, carrying him to the extreme frenzy, the consumption of all the senses. And you were satisfying your own taste for fairy tales, you were proud of your inventions. Perhaps, but for the short while he still lived, I made him happy. And then, I am telling you of these conversations of ours as if they all took place in one day, but in me too a new flame had been kindled, and I lived in a state of constant exaltation, which I tried to transmit to him, giving him, in disguise, some of my own happiness. I had met Hypatia, 32. Buandolino sees a lady with a unicorn. Before that, there was the story of the army of monsters, Master Nikitas. The terror of the white Huns had grown, and was more obsessive than ever, because a skiapod who had ventured to the extreme boundaries of the province, those creatures at times liked to run, infinitely, as if their will were dominated by that one tireless foot, came back and reported having seen them. They had yellow faces, with very long mustaches, and were short of stature. Mounted on horses, small as they were, but very swift, they seemed to form a single body. They traveled through deserts and steppes, carrying only, besides their weapons, a leather flask for milk and a little earthen pan for cooking the food that they found along the way, but they could ride for days and days without eating or drinking. They had attacked the caravan of a caliph, with slaves, odalisques, camels. They encamped in sumptuous tents. The caliph's warriors moved towards the Huns, and they were handsome and awful to see, gigantic men who dashed forward on their camels, armed with terrible curved swords. Under that rush, the Huns pretended to retreat, drawing their pursuers after them, then they formed a circle, swooping around them, and letting out fierce cries, as they massacred them. They invaded the camp and cut the throats of all the survivors, women, servants, all, even the children, leaving alive only one witness of the slaughter. They fired the tents and resumed their ride without even indulging in pillage, a sign that they destroyed only to spread everywhere the word that where they passed grass no longer grew, and at the next conflict their victims would already be paralyzed with terror. It may be that the skiapod spoke after he had refreshed himself with Burke, but who could verify whether he was reporting things seen or was raving? Fear began to spread in Pendapedzum. You could sense it in the air, in the low voices of the people as they spread news from mouth to mouth, as if the invaders could already hear them. At this point the poet decided to take seriously the offers of Praxias, even if they had been disguised as a drunkard's ravings. He said the white Huns could arrive any moment, and what could he oppose them with? The Nubians, of course, fighters prepared for sacrifice, but then? Except for the pygmies, who could handle a bow against the cranes, would the skiapods fight barehanded, would the ponces attack with member-shouldered, would the tunnelists be sent out as advanced scouts to report what they had seen? Yet from that collection of monsters, exploiting the possibilities of each, a fearsome army could be assembled. And if there was anyone who knew how to do it, it was the poet. One can aspire to the imperial crown after having been a victorious general. At least so it has happened several times with us in Byzantium. To be sure, this was the intention of my friend. The eunuchs agreed at once. In my opinion, as long as they remained at peace, the poet and his army did not represent a danger, and if there was to be a war, they might at least delay the entry of those wild men into the city, causing them to spend more time crossing the mountains. And besides, the building of an army kept the subjects in a state of obedient wakefulness, and this is surely what they had always wanted. Buandolino, who did not like war, asked to be left out. Not the others. The poet decided the 5 Alessandrians would be good captains, because he had experienced the siege of their city, and on the other side, the side of the defeated. He trusted also Ardzruni, who perhaps could teach the monsters how to build some war machines. He did not overlook Solomon. An army, he said, must include a man expert in medicine, because you don't make an omelet without breaking eggs. In the end, he decided that even Boron and Kayat, whom he considered dreamers, could have a function in his plan, because as men of letters they could keep the army's books, tend to the stores, provide for the feeding of the warriors. He carefully pondered the nature and the virtues of the various races. The Nubians and the Pygmies were ideal. He had only to decide where to deploy them in a future battle. The skiapods, swift as they were, could be used as assault squads. They could approach the enemy, slipping rapidly among ferns and grasses, popping up suddenly before those yellow faces with the big mustaches could be aware of them. They had only to be trained in the use of the blowpipe or the fistula, as Ardzruni suggested, easy to construct, since the area abounded in cane brakes. Perhaps Solomon, among all those herbs in the market, could find a poison in which arrows could be dipped, and he shouldn't go all squeamish because war is war. Solomon replied that his people, in the days of Masada, had given the Romans a hard time, because the Jews weren't people who suffered a slap without speaking up, as the Gentiles might believe. The giants could be employed well, not at a distance, because of that single eye of theirs, but for close fighting, perhaps jumping out of the grass right after the attack of the sciapods. With their height, they would completely overshadow the tiny horses of the white Huns, able to stop them with a punch on the nose, grabbing their mane with their bare hands, shaking them until the rider fell from his saddle, then finishing him off with a kick, since their feet were twice as big as a sciapod's. The employment of the Blemier, the Ponces, and the Penosians remained more complicated. Ardzruni suggested that these last, with those ears, could be used to glide down from above. If birds keep themselves in the air by flapping their wings, why couldn't the Penosians do it with their ears? Boron agreed, and luckily they don't flap them in a vacuum. So the Penosians were to be kept for the unhappy moment when the white Huns, having overcome the first defenses, entered the city. The Penosians would await them in their high cliffside refuges, then would fall on their heads to slit their throats, if they were well trained in the use of the knife, even one made of obsidian. The Blemier could not be used as lookouts, because in order to see they would have to expose their chests, and in combat this would be suicide. However, cleverly deployed, as an assault force they wouldn't be bad, because the white Hun has been, it was presumed, accustomed to aim at the head and, confronted by an enemy without a head, there would be at least a moment of bewilderment. This moment was what the Blemier could exploit, falling on the horses with stone axes. The Ponces were the weak element in the poet's military science, for how can you send people into the field with their penis on their belly? They would take the first impact on their balls, knocked flat on the ground, crying for their mother. They could, however, be used as sentries, because the friends had discovered that for the Ponces the penis was like the antennae of certain insects, which at the slightest shift in the wind or change of temperature, stiffen, and start vibrating. And so they could act as scouts, sent ahead, and then if they all ended up being the first killed, the poet said, war is war and leaves no room for Christian pity. As for the Tunless, the first thought was that they could be left to stew in their own juice because they were so undisciplined. For a general they could create more problems than the enemy. Then it was decided that, after duly scourging them, they could work in the rear lines, helping the younger eunuchs who, with Solomon, would tend the wounded, while keeping the women and children of every race calm, careful not to stick their head out of their holes. Gavagai, at their first encounter, had mentioned the satyrs that are never seen, and the poet presumed they could strike with their horns, and leap goat-like on their forked hoofs, but every question concerning this race received only evasive answers. They lived on the mountain, beyond the lake, which one? And naturally no one had ever seen them. Formerly subjects of the priest, they lived to themselves, never dealing with the others, and so it was as if they did not exist. Oh, well, the poet said, they might even have curved horns, with the tips turned in or out, and to strike they'd have to lie on their backs or move on all fours. Let's be serious about this. You can't conduct a war with goats. Yes, you can conduct a war with goats, Ardzruni said. He told of a great general who had tied torches to the horns of goats and then sent thousands of them at night into the plains from which the enemies were arriving, making them believe that the defenders had an immense army at their command. Since they had goats with 6 horns available, the effect would be powerful. Imposing. That's if the enemy arrives at night, the poet remarked, skeptically. In any case, Ardzruni should prepare many goats and many torches. You never know. On the basis of these principles, unknown to Vegetius and Frontinus, the training program began. The plain was populated with sciapods, who practiced blowing into their brand new fistulas, while Porcelli cursed every time they missed the target, and thank God he confined himself to cursing Christ, and for those heretics taking the name in vain of one who was only an adoptive son was not a sin. Calandrino took charge of teaching the Penosians to fly, something they had never done, but it seemed as if the Almighty had created them for that very purpose. It was hard to move about the streets of Pentapedzum because, when you least expected it, a Penosian would fall on your head. But all had accepted the idea that they were making ready for a war, and nobody complained. Happiest of all were the Penosians, so amazed at discovering their incredible talents that by now even the women and children wanted to take part in the enterprise, and the poet gladly consented. Scotchabarosi trained the giants in the capture of horses, but the only horses around were those of the Magi, and after 2 or 3 sessions the animals risked giving up the ghost, so Bonehead turned to the asses. They were even better, because the asses kicked and brayed, and it was harder to catch them by the collar than a galloping horse, and the giants now became masters of this skill. However, they also had to learn how to run, bent over, through the ferns, so as not to be seen immediately by the enemies, and many of them complained because after every drill they had aching backs. Boide trained the pygmies, because a white Hun is not a crane and you had to aim between the eyes. The poet himself indoctrinated the Nubians, who were waiting for nothing better than to die in battle. Solomon looked for venomous potions and kept trying to dip some sharp point into them, but he managed only to put a rabbit to sleep for a few minutes, and another time he inspired a hen to fly. No matter, the poet said, a white Hun who falls asleep for the duration of a benedicite or who starts flapping his arms is already a dead Hun. Keep at it. Kutika wore himself out with the Blemier, teaching them to crawl under a horse and slice his belly with an axe blow, but trying this with an ass was not easy. As for the Ponces, since they were part of the quartermaster corps, they were under the care of Boron and Coyote. Buandolino informed the deacon of what was happening, and the young man seemed reborn. With the eunuch's permission, he had himself led out onto the steps, and from above he observed the drilling troops. He said he wanted to learn how to mount a horse, to lead his subjects, but immediately he felt faint, perhaps from excess emotion, and the eunuchs conducted him back to the throne, to languish again. It was during those days that, partly from curiosity and partly from boredom, Buandolino asked himself where the satyrs that are never seen might live. He asked everybody, even questioning one of the Ponces, though he had never managed to decipher their language. The reply was, Prug frest friends Sorgman strocht drhds pag brle lang gravid shavini rust pkalhdrcg, which wasn't much. Even Gavagai remained vague. Over there, he said, and he pointed to a series of bluish hills to the west, beyond which the distant mountains stood out, but over there was a place no one had ever gone, because the satyrs don't like intruders. How do the satyrs think? Buandolino asked, and Gavagai answered that they thought most wrong of all, because they held that there had never been original sin. Men had not become mortal as a result of that sin. They would be so even if Adam had never eaten the apple. So there is no need of redemption, and each can save himself through his own good will. The whole Jesus story served only to offer us an example of a virtuous life and nothing else. Almost like the heretics of Mahumeth, who believes Jesus is only a prophet. Asked why no one ever went to the satyrs' country, Gavagai answered that at the foot of the satyrs' hill there was a wood with a lake, and all were forbidden to go there, because it was inhabited by a race of bad women, all pagans. The eunuch said that a good Christian does not go there, because he could encounter witchcraft, and no one went. But Gavagai, slyly, described so well the path to that place that it could be thought that he, or some other skiapod, in their dashing all over, had taken a peek there. This was enough to stir Buandolino's curiosity. He waited until nobody was paying any attention to him, mounted his horse, and in less than 2 hours he crossed a vast expanse of brush and reached the edge of the wood. He tied his horse to a tree and entered that green expanse, cool and scented. Stumbling over the roots that surfaced at every step, grazing enormous mushrooms of every color, he finally arrived at the shore of a lake beyond which rose the slopes of the satyrs' hills. It was the sunset hour. The waters of the lake, very clear, were darkening, reflecting the long shadow of the many cypresses that lined it. A deep silence reigned everywhere, not broken even by bird song. While Buandolino was meditating on the shores of that mirror of water, he saw emerge from the wood an animal he had never come upon in his life, but he recognized it immediately. It looked like a horse, a foal. It was all white and its movements were delicate and supple. On its well-shaped muzzle, just above the brow, it had a horn, also white, spiral in form, ending in a sharp point. It was the leocorn, or, as Buandolino used to say when he was little, the leoncorn, or unicorn, the monoceros of his childish imaginings. He admired it, holding his breath, when behind it, from the woods, a female form appeared. Tall, enfolded in a long garment that gracefully outlined 2 erect little breasts, the creature walked with the step of a languid tame leopard, and her garment swept the grass that enhanced the lake shore, as if she were gliding over the earth. She had long soft blonde hair, which fell to her hips, and a very pure profile, as if she had been modeled after an ivory brooch. Her complexion was a faint pink, and that angelic face was turned towards the lake in an attitude of mute prayer. The unicorn meekly pawed at the ground around her, sometimes raising its face with its little nostrils quivering, to receive a caress. Buandolino watched, rapt. You, Master Nikitas, must bear in mind that since the beginning of my journey I had not seen a woman worthy of that name. Don't misunderstand me. It was not desire that had overcome me, but a feeling of serene adoration, not just of her but also of the animal, the calm lake, the mountains, the light of that declining day. I felt as if I were in a temple. Buandolino was trying, with his words, to describe his vision, something that is surely impossible. You see, there are moments when perfection itself appears in a hand or in a face, in some nuance on the flank of a hill or on the sea's surface. Moments when your heart is paralyzed before the miracle of beauty. That creature seemed to me at that moment a superb aquatic bird, a heron, or a swan. I said her hair was blonde, but no. As the head slowly moved, the hair at times had bluish glints, at other times it seemed to have a light fire running through it. I could see the outline of her bosom, soft and delicate as the breast of a dove. I had become nothing but pure gaze. I saw something ancient, because I knew I was not seeing something beautiful, but beauty itself, like the holy thought of God. I was discovering that perfection, even glimpsing it once, and once only, was something light and lovely. I looked at that form from the distance, but I felt that I had no hold on that image, as happens when you are on in years and you seem to glimpse clear signs on a parchment, but you know that the moment you move closer they will blur, and you will never be able to read the secret that the page was promising you, or, as in dreams, when something you desire appears to you, you reach out, move your fingers in the void, and grasp nothing. I envy you that enchantment. Rather than shatter it, I transformed myself into a statue. 33. Buandolino meets Hypatia. But the enchantment was finished. A creature of the woods, the maiden sensed the presence of Buandolino and turned towards him. She had not an instant of fear, only a bewildered gaze. She said in Greek, "Who are you?" When he did not answer, she boldly approached him, examining, studying him closely, without shame and without coyness. and her eyes were like her hair, of shifting color. The unicorn had come to her side, his head lowered, as if to extend his beautiful weapon in the defense of his mistress. "You are not from Pindapedzum," she then said. "You are neither a eunuch nor a monster. You are a man?" She showed that she recognized a man, as he had recognized the unicorn, from having heard man mentioned many times, but never having seen one. "You are beautiful, a man is beautiful. May I touch you?" She reached out and, with her slender fingers, she stroked his beard and grazed the scar on his face, as Beatrice had done that day. This was a wound. "Are you one of those men who make war?" "And what is that?" "A sword," Buandolino answered, "but I use it in my defense against wild beasts. I am not a man who makes war. My name is Buandolino, and I come from the lands where the sun sets, over there," and he made a vague gesture. He noticed that his hand was trembling. "Who are you?" "I'm a Hypatia," she said, with the tone of someone amused to hear such a naive question, and she laughed, becoming still more beautiful. Then, remembering that she was speaking with a foreigner, "In this wood, beyond those trees, only we Hypatias live. You're not afraid of me, like those of Pindapedzum are?" This time it was Buandolino who smiled. It was she who feared he was afraid. "Do you come here to the lake often?" he asked. "Not always," the Hypatia answered. "Our mother does not wish us to come out of the wood alone. But the lake is so beautiful, and Icasios protects me." She pointed to the unicorn. Then she added, with a worried look, "It is late. I must not stay away so long. I should not meet the people of Pindapedzum either, if they come this far. But you are not one of them, you are a man, and no one has ever told me to keep away from men. I'll come back tomorrow," Buandolino dared to say, "but when the sun is high in the sky." "Will you be here?" "I don't know," the Hypatia said, troubled, perhaps. And she vanished lightly among the trees. That night Buandolino couldn't sleep. In any case, he said, he had already dreamed, enough to remember that dream for all his life. However, the next day, just at noon, he took his horse and returned to the lake. He waited till evening, not seeing anyone. Dejected, he turned towards home, and at the edge of the city he ran into a group of skiapods who were practicing with their fistulas. He saw Gavagai, who said to him, "You, look." He aimed the reed up high, fired the dart, and killed a bird, which fell nearby. "I great fighter," Gavagai said, "if White Hun arrive I pass through him." Buandolino congratulated him, and went off at once to sleep. That night he dreamed of the previous day's encounter, and in the morning he told himself that one dream is not enough for a whole life. He went back to the lake again. He remained seated by the water, listening to the song of the birds, who were celebrating morning, then the cicadas, at the hour when the noonday devil rages. But it was not hot, the trees spread a delightful coolness, and it cost him no pain to wait there for a few hours. Then she reappeared. She sat down beside him and told him she had come back because she wanted to learn more about men. Buandolino didn't know where to begin, and he started describing the place where he was born, the events of Frederick's court, what empires are in kingdoms, how you hunt with a falcon, what a city is and how you build one, the same things he had told the deacon, avoiding grim or lewd stories, and realizing, as he spoke, that men could even be portrayed with affection. She listened to him, her glistening eyes changing color according to her emotion. "How well you talk. Do all men tell beautiful stories like you?" "No," Buandolino admitted. Perhaps he told more and better ones than the others of his race, but among them there were also the poets, who could speak better still. And he began singing one of Abdul's songs. She didn't understand the Provençal words, but, like the Abkhazia, she was bewitched by the melody. Now her eyes were veiled with dew. "Tell me," she asked, blushing slightly, "do men also have their females?" She asked this as if she had understood that what Buandolino sang was addressed to a woman. "Yes, indeed," Buandolino answered. "Just as male skiapods mate with female skiapods, so men mate with women. Otherwise they cannot make children, and that's how it is," he added, "in the whole universe." "That's not true," the Hypatia said, laughing. "Hypatias are simply Hypatias, and there are how can I say it, no Hypatios." And she laughed again, amused at the very idea. Buandolino wondered what it would take to hear her laugh again, because her laughter was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. He was tempted to ask her how Hypatias are born, but was afraid of marring her innocence. At this point, however, he did feel encouraged to ask her who the Hypatias were. "Oh," she said, "it's a long story. I don't know how to tell long stories the way you do. You must realize that 1,000 years ago, in a powerful and distant city, there lived a wise and virtuous woman named Hypatia. She had a school of philosophy, which means love of wisdom. But in that city also some bad men lived, who were called Christians. They did not fear the gods, they felt hatred towards philosophy, and they particularly could not tolerate the fact that a female should know the truth. One day they seized Hypatia and put her to death amid horrible tortures. Now some of the younger of her female disciples were spared, perhaps because they were believed to be ignorant maidens who were with her only to serve her. They fled, but the Christians by now were everywhere, and the girls had to journey a long time before reaching this place of peace. Here they tried to keep alive what they had learned from their mistress, but they had heard her speak when they were still very young, they were not wise as she had been, and they didn't remember clearly all her teachings. So they told themselves they would live together, apart from the world, to rediscover what Hypatia had really said. Also because God has left shadows of truth in the depths of the heart of each of us, and it is a matter only of bringing them forth, to shine in the light of wisdom, as you free the pulp of the fruit from its skin. God, the gods, which if they were not the God of the Christians were necessarily false and treacherous. But what was this Hypatia saying? Buandolino wondered. However, it mattered little to him, for him it was enough to hear her and he was already prepared to die for her truth. Tell me one thing at least, he interrupted her. You are the Hypatias, in the name of that Hypatia. This I can understand. But what is your name? Hypatia. No, I mean you, yourself. What are you called? To distinguish you from another Hypatia. I'm asking. What do your companions call you? Hypatia. But this evening you will go back to the place where all of you live, and you will meet one Hypatia before the others. How will you greet her? I will wish her a happy evening. That's what we do, yes, but if I go back to Pindapedzum, and I see, for example, a eunuch, he will say to me, Happy evening, O Buandolino. You will say, Happy evening, oh, what? If you like, I will say, Happy evening, Hypatia. So all of you then are called Hypatia. Naturally, all Hypatias are called Hypatia, no one is different from the others, otherwise she wouldn't be a Hypatia. But if one Hypatia or another is looking for you, just now when you are absent, and asks another Hypatia if she has seen that Hypatia who goes around with a unicorn named Acasios, how would she say it? Just as you did, she is looking for the Hypatia who goes around with a unicorn named Acasios. If Gavagai had given him such an answer, Buandolino would have been tempted to slap him. But not with Hypatia. Buandolino already was thinking how marvelous the place must be, where all the Hypatias were called Hypatia. But it took several days, Master Nikitas, for me to understand what the Hypatias really were. So you saw more of each other, I imagine. Every day, or almost. I couldn't do without seeing her and listening to her. This shouldn't surprise you, but it surprised me, and filled me with infinite pride, as I understood that she, too, was happy to see me and listen to me. I was like a child again who seeks its mother's breast, and when the mother is not present, he weeps for fear she will never come back again. It happens also to dogs with their masters. But this matter of the Hypatias arouses my curiosity. Because perhaps you know, or don't know, that Hypatia really did exist, even if it was not 1,000 years ago, but rather, 8 centuries, and she lived in Alexandria in Egypt, when the empire was ruled by Theodosius and then by Arcadius. She really was, we are told, a woman of great wisdom, learned in philosophy, in mathematics, and in astronomy, and even men drank in her every word. In the meantime our holy religion had triumphed in all the territories of the empire. There were still some unruly people who were trying to keep alive the thought of the pagan philosophers, such as the divine Plato, and I will not deny that they were doing good, transmitting also to us Christians the learning that would have been lost otherwise. But one of the greatest Christians of the time, who later became a saint of the church, Cyril, a man of great faith but also of great intransigence, considered Hypatia's teaching contrary to the Gospels and unleashed against her a horde of ignorant and enraged Christians, who didn't even know what she was preaching, but now considered her, with Cyril as witness, dissolute and a liar. Perhaps she was slandered, even if it is also true that women should not meddle in divine questions. In sum, they dragged her into a temple, stripped her naked, killed her, massacred her body with sharp shards of broken vessels, and put her corpse on a pyre. Many legends sprang up about her. They say she was very beautiful, but had taken a vow of virginity. One young man, her disciple, fell madly in love with her, and she showed him a cloth with the blood of her menses, telling him that only this was the object of his desire, not beauty itself. In reality, what she taught no one has ever known exactly. All her writings were lost. Those who had preserved her spoken thought had been killed, or had tried to forget what they had heard. Everything we know of her has been handed down to us by the Holy Fathers who condemned her, and, honestly, as a writer of history and chronicles, I tend not to give too much credence to words that an enemy puts into the mouth of an enemy. They had other meetings and many conversations. Hypatia would talk, and Buandolino hoped her learning was extensive, infinite, so he would never stop hanging on her lips. She answered all of Buandolino's questions, with intrepid sincerity, never blushing. Nothing for her was restricted by any sordid prohibition, all was transparent. Buandolino finally dared ask her how the Hypatias, after so many centuries, perpetuated themselves. She answered that at every season the mother chose some of them who would procreate, and she accompanied them to the fecundators. Hypatia was vague about these. Naturally, she had never seen them, nor had she ever seen the Hypatias destined for the rite. They were led to a place, at night, they drank a potion that inebriated and dazed them, they were fecundated, then they returned to their community, where those who remained pregnant were tended by their companions until the birth. If the fruit of their womb was male, it was returned to the fecundators, who would bring it up as one of themselves. If it was female, it remained in the community and grew up as an Hypatia. To be joined carnally, Hypatia said, like animals, who have no soul, is only a way of multiplying the error of creation. The Hypatias sent to the fecundators accept this humiliation only because we must continue to exist, to redeem the world from that error. Those who have undergone fecundation remember nothing of that act, which, if it were not performed in the spirit of sacrifice, would alter our apathy. What is apathy? The state in which every Hypatia lives and is happy to live. What is the error of creation? Why, Buandolino, she said, laughing with innocent amazement, does it seem to you that the world is perfect? Look at this flower, look at the delicacy of the stem, look at this kind of porous eye that triumphs in its catch of the morning dew as in a shell, look at the joy with which it offers itself to this insect that now is sucking its juice. Isn't it beautiful? It is indeed beautiful, but, in fact, isn't it beautiful that it is beautiful? Isn't this a divine miracle? Buandolino, tomorrow morning this flower will be dead, in 2 days it will be rotten. Come with me. She led him into the brush and showed him a mushroom, its red crown striped with yellow flames. Is this beautiful? She said. It is beautiful. It's poisonous. Anyone who eats it, dies. Do you consider a creation perfect when death is hiding in it? You know that I, too, would be dead one day, and I, too, would be rotten matter, if I were not dedicated to God's redemption? God's redemption? Explain. Surely you're not a Christian, too, Buandolino, like the monsters of Pentapedzum? The Christians who killed Hypatia believed in a cruel divinity who had created the world, and, with it, death, suffering and, even worse than physical suffering, the sickness of the soul. Created beings are capable of hating, killing, of making their fellows suffer. You can't believe that a just God could have destined his children to this misery. These things are done by unjust men, and God punishes them, while saving the good. But then why would this God have created us, only to expose us to the risk of damnation? Why? Because the supreme good is the freedom to do good or evil, and, to give his children this supreme good, God must accept the fact that some of them will make bad use of it. Why do you say that freedom is good? Because if they deprive you of it, if they put you in chains, if they will not allow you to do what you wish, you suffer, and therefore the absence of freedom is an evil. You can turn your head so that you can look behind you, but can you really turn it until you can see your own back? Can you enter that lake and remain underwater until evening, I mean really underwater, without ever sticking your head out? She asked, laughing. No, because if I tried to turn my head completely, I would break my neck. If I remained underwater, it would prevent me from breathing. God created me with these restrictions to prevent me from doing myself harm. Then you say that he has deprived you of some freedoms for a good end, is that right? He took them from me so that I would not suffer. Then why has he given you the freedom to choose between good and evil, with the risk that you may then suffer eternal punishments? God gave us freedom thinking that we would use it well. But there was the revolt of the angels, which brought evil into the world, and the serpent tempted Eve, so now we all suffer from original sin. It isn't God's fault. And who created the rebel angels and the serpent? God, of course, but before they rebelled the angels were good, as he had made them. Then it was they who created evil? No, they committed it, but it existed before, as a possibility of rebellion against God. So it was God who created evil? Hypatia, you are clever, sensitive, quick, you can conduct a disputatio much better than I, even though I studied in Paris. But don't say such things to me about the good God. He cannot wish evil, certainly not. A God who wishes evil would be the contrary of God. So God found evil beside him, without wishing it, as the dark part of himself. But God is the totally perfect being. Of course, Buandolino, God is the greatest perfection that can exist, but if you only knew what hard work it is to be perfect. Now, Buandolino, I'll tell you who God is, or, rather, what he is not. She truly was afraid of nothing. She said, God is the unique, and he is so perfect that he does not resemble any of the things that exist or any of the things that do not. You cannot describe him using your human intelligence, as if he were someone who becomes angry if you are bad or who worries about you out of goodness, someone who has a mouth, ears, face, wings, or that is spirit, father or son, not even of himself. Of the unique you cannot say he is or is not, he embraces all but is nothing. You can name him only through dissimilarity, because it is futile to call him goodness, beauty, wisdom, amiability, power, justice. It would be like calling him bear, panther, serpent, dragon, or griffin, because whatever you say of him you will never express him. God is not body, is not figure, is not form. He does not have quantity, quality, weight, or lightness. He does not see, does not hear, does not know disorder and perturbation. He is not soul, intelligence, imagination, opinion, thought, word, number, order, size. He is not equality and is not inequality, is not time and is not eternity. He is a will without purpose. Try to understand, Buandolino. God is a lamp without flame, a flame without fire, a fire without heat, a dark light, a silent rumble, a blind flash, a luminous soot, a ray of his own darkness, a circle that expands concentrating on its own center, a solitary multiplicity. He is. She paused, seeking an example that would convince them both, she the teacher and he the pupil. He is a space that is not, in which you and I are the same thing, as we are today in this time that doesn't flow. A faint flame trembled on her cheek. He was silent, frightened by that incongruous example, but how could he consider incongruous any addition to a list of incongruities? Buandolino felt the same flame piercing his chest, but in his fear for her embarrassment, he stiffened, not allowing a single muscle of his face to betray the sterns of his heart, nor his voice to tremble, and asked, with theological firmness. But, creation then? And evil? Hypatia's face resumed its roseate pallor. Then the unique, because of his perfection, through generosity of himself, tends to expand, to widen in ever broader spheres of his own fullness. He is, like a candle, victim of the spreading light. The brighter it grows the more it melts. Yes, God liquefies in the shadows of himself, becomes a throng of divine messengers, eons that have much of his power, but in a form already weaker. There are many gods, demons, archons, tyrants, forces, sparks, stars, and what the Christians call angels or archangels. But they are not created by the unique, they are an emanation of him. Emanation? You see that bird? Sooner or later it will generate another bird through an egg, as a Hypatia can generate a child from her womb. But, once generated, the creature, whether Hypatia or little bird, lives on its own, survives even if the mother dies. Now think, on the contrary, of fire. Fire does not generate heat, it emanates it. Heat is the same thing as fire. If you were to put out the fire, the heat would also cease. The heat of the fire is very strong where the fire is born, and it becomes gradually weaker as the flame becomes smoke. So it is with God. As he gradually expands from his own dark center, he somehow loses vigor, and he loses more and more until he becomes viscous and insensitive matter, like the shapeless wax of the melting candle. The unique could not wish to emanate so far from himself, but he cannot resist this dissolving of himself into multiplicity and disorder. And this God of yours cannot dissolve the evil that forms around him? Oh, yes, he could. The unique constantly tries to reabsorb this sort of breath that can become poison, and for 70 times 7,000 years he has succeeded continually to make his residue return into nothingness. The life of God was a regulated breathing, he panted without effort. Like this. Listen. She breathed in the air, vibrating her delicate nostrils, then exhaled the breath from her mouth. One day, however, he was unable to control one of his intermediary powers, which we call the demiurge, and which is perhaps Sabaoth or Ildabath, the false god of the Christians. This imitation of God, through a mistake, or through pride, or through ignorance, created time, where before there had been only eternity. Time is an eternity that stammers. You understand? And with time, he created fire, which gives heat but also risks burning everything. Water, which quenches thirst but also drowns. Earth, which nourishes the grasses but can become avalanche and suffocate them. Air, which lets us breathe but can become hurricane. He did everything wrong, poor demiurge. He made the sun, which gives light, but can scorch meadows. The moon, which succeeds in dominating night for only a few days, then grows thinner and dies. The other celestial bodies, which are splendid but can emit baleful influences, and then the creatures endowed with intelligence, but unable to understand the great mysteries. The animals, who are sometimes faithful and sometimes threaten us. The vegetables, which feed us but have brief life. The minerals, without life, without soul, without intelligence, condemned never to understand anything. The demiurge was like a child, who messes in the mud to imitate the beauty of a unicorn, and what comes out looks more like a mouse. So the world is a sickness of God? If you are perfect, you cannot fail to emanate yourself. If you emanate yourself, you become sick. And you must try to understand that God, in his fullness, is also the place, or non-place, where the opposites are confounded, isn't he? The opposites? Yes. We feel heat and cold, light and darkness, and all those things that are one contrary to the other. Sometimes we do not like the cold, and to us it seems bad compared to heat. But sometimes the heat is too great, and we want coolness. We are the ones who, confronted with opposites, believe, as our whim, our passion takes us, that one of them is good and the other evil. Now, in God opposites are reconciled and find reciprocal harmony. But when God begins to be emanated, he can no longer control the harmony of the opposites, and this is broken and they fight with one another. The demiurge has lost control of the opposites, and has created a world where silence and noise, yes and no, one good against another good fight among themselves. This is what we feel is evil. Warming to her argument, she moved her hands like a little girl who, speaking of a mouse, imitates its form, or, naming a tempest, draws whirlwinds in the air. You speak of the errors of creation, Hypatia, and of evil, but as if none of it touched you, and you live in this wood as if everything were beautiful like you. If evil itself comes from God, there must be something good in evil. Listen to me, because you are a man, and men are not used to thinking in the right way of everything that is. I knew it. I also think wrong. No, you just think. And thinking isn't enough. This isn't the right way. Now, try to imagine a spring that has no source and spreads out into 1,000 rivers, without ever going dry. The spring remains calm always, cool and clear, while the rivers flow towards different places, and become murky with sand, become congested among rocks, and cough, strangled, and sometimes they run dry. Rivers suffer greatly, did you know that? And yet, however muddy the rivers or the streams may be, they are still water, and come from the same source as this lake. This lake suffers less than a river because in its clarity it recalls better the source from which it is born. A pond full of insects suffers more than a lake or a stream. But all in some way suffer because they would like to return whence they came, and they have forgotten how. Hypatia took Buandolino by the arm, and made him turn towards the wood. As she did this, her head moved close to his, and he sensed the vegetal perfume of those tresses. Look at that tree. What flows in it, from the roots to the last leaf, is the same life. But the roots are strengthened in the earth, the trunk grows sturdier and survives all the seasons, whereas the boughs tend to turn brittle and break, the leaves last a few months and then fall, the buds live a few weeks. There is more sickness in the fronds than in the trunk. The tree is one, but it suffers as it expands, because it becomes many, and in multiplying, it is weakened. But the fronds are beautiful, you yourself enjoy their shade. You see, buandolino, you, too, can become wise. If these fronds didn't exist, we wouldn't sit here and talk about God. If the wood didn't exist, we would never have met, and this perhaps would be the worst of evils. She said this as if it were bare, simple truth, but buandolino felt his chest pierced once again, unable or unwilling to reveal his tremor. Then explain this to me. How can the many be good, at least to some degree, if they are a sickness of the unique? You see, buandolino, you, too, can become wise. You said, to some degree. In spite of error, a part of the unique has remained in each of us thinking creatures, and also in each of the other creatures, from animals to dead bodies. Everything that surrounds us is inhabited by the gods. Plants, seeds, flowers, roots, springs, each of them, though suffering at being only a bad imitation of the thought of God, could wish for nothing save to be united with him. We must find again the harmony between opposites, we must help the gods, we must revive these sparks, these memories of the unique which lies still buried in our spirit and in things themselves. Twice Hypatia had casually said that it was beautiful to be with him. This encouraged buandolino to return. One day Hypatia explained to him what they did to revive the divine spark in all things, because these things sympathetically referred to something more perfect than they, not directly to God, but to his less extenuated emanations. She led him to a spot near the lake where some sunflowers grew, while lotus flowers spread over the water. You see what the heliotrope does? It moves following the sun, seeks it, prays to it, and it's too bad you still don't know how to listen to the murmur it makes in the air as it fulfills its circular motion in the arc of the day. You would realize that it sings its hymn to the sun. Now look at the lotus. It opens at sunrise, offers itself completely at the zenith, and closes when the sun goes away. It praises the sun, opening and closing its petals, as we open and close our lips when we pray. These flowers live in sympathy with the planet and therefore retain a part of its power. If you act upon the flower, you will act upon the sun. If you can act upon the sun, you can influence its action, and from the sun be joined with something that lives in sympathy with the sun, and is more perfect than the sun. This doesn't happen only with flowers, it happens with stones and with animals. Each of us is inhabited by a lesser God, who tries to connect us, through the more powerful, to our common origin. We learn from infancy to practice an art that allows us to act on the major gods and re-establish the lost bond. What does that mean? It's easy. We learn to weave together stones, herbs, odors, perfect and godlike, to form, how can I say it to you? Some vessels of sympathy that condense the strength of many elements. You know, a flower, a stone, even a unicorn, all have a divine character, but by themselves they are unable to evoke the greater gods. Our compounds, thanks to art, reproduce the essence that one wants to evoke, they multiply the power of each element. And then, when you have evoked these greater gods, that point is only the beginning. We learn to become messengers between what is above and what is below. We prove that the current in which God emanates himself can be retraced, only a short way, but we show nature that this is possible. The supreme task, however, is not to connect a sunflower with the sun, it is to connect ourselves with our origin. This is where ascesis begins. In the beginning, we learn to behave in a virtuous manner, we do not kill living creatures, we try to spread harmony among the beings that are around us, and in doing this, we can revive hidden sparks everywhere. You see these blades of grass? They are now yellowed, and are drooping to the ground. I can touch them and make them vibrate again, make them feel what they have forgotten. Look. Little by little, they regain their freshness, as if they were just now springing from the earth. Yet this is not enough. To revive this blade of grass, it suffices to exercise the natural virtues, achieve perfection of sight and hearing, vigor of body, memory, and facility for learning, refinement of manners, through frequent ablutions, lustral ceremonies, hymns, prayers. You make a step forward by cultivating wisdom, strength, temperance, and justice, and finally you arrive at acquiring the purifying virtues. We try to separate the soul from the body, we learn to evoke the gods. Not to speak of the gods, as the other philosophers did, but to act upon them, causing rains to fall through a magic sphere, setting amulets against earthquakes, testing the divinatory powers of tripods, animating statues to obtain oracles, summoning Asclepius to heal the sick. But you have to be careful. In doing this we must always avoid being possessed by a god, because in that case we become unruly and agitated, and therefore move away from God. We must learn to do this in the most absolute calm. Hypatia took buandolino's hand, he kept it motionless so as not to end that sensation of warmth. Buandolino, perhaps I am making you believe I am already far advanced in ascesis, like my older sisters. If you only knew, on the contrary, how imperfect I still am. I still become confused when I put a rose in contact with the superior power who is its friend. And, you see, I still talk a great deal, and this is a sign that I am not wise, because virtue is won in silence. But I speak because you are here, and you must be instructed, and if I instruct a sunflower, why shouldn't I instruct you? We will reach a more perfect stage when we are able to be together without speaking. It will be enough to touch each other and you will understand all the same. As with the sunflower, she stroked the sunflower, in silence. Then, in silence, she began stroking buandolino's hand, and said only, at the end, you feel. The next day she spoke to him of the silence cultivated by the Hypatias, in order, she said, for him to learn it too. You have to create an absolute calm, all around you. You remain alone, remote from everything we have thought, imagined, and felt. You find peace and serenity. Then we will no longer experience wrath or desire, sorrow or happiness. We will have moved out of ourselves, wrapped in absolute solitude and profound calm. We will no longer look at things beautiful and good. We will be beyond goodness itself, beyond the course of virtues, like someone entering the sanctum of the church, leaving behind the statues of the gods, as his vision is no longer of images but of God himself. We must stop invoking intermediary powers. Passing beyond them, we will overcome the flaw. In that retreat, in that inaccessible and holy place, we will arrive beyond the race of the gods and the hierarchies of the eons. All these things will now be in us as memory of something we have cured of its sickness of being. That will be the end of the journey, the loosening of every bond, the flight of one, now alone, towards the only. In this return to the absolutely simple we will no longer see anything, except the glory of the darkness. Soul and intellect drained, we will arrive beyond the realm of the mind. In veneration we will rest there, as if we were a sun rising. With closed pupils we will gaze at the sun's light. We will become fire, fire in that darkness, and along paths of fire we will complete our arc. And, at that moment, when we have traveled against the current of the river, and have proved not only to ourselves but also to the gods and to God that one can move against the current, we will have healed the world, killed evil, made death die. We will have dissolved the knot in which the fingers of the demiurge were entangled. We, buandolino, are destined to heal God. To us his redemption has been entrusted. We will bring back, through our ecstasy, all creation in the very heart of the unique one. We will give the unique one the strength to take that great breath that enables him to absorb into himself the evil he has exhaled. You do it? Some one of you has done it? We are waiting to succeed in it. All of us have been preparing ourselves for centuries so that one of us will succeed. What we have learned, since childhood, is that it's not necessary for all of us to achieve this miracle. It's enough if one day, even in another 1,000 years, just one of us, the chosen one, reaches the moment of supreme perfection, in which she feels one with her own remote origin, and the miracle will be achieved. Then, proving that from the multiplicity of the suffering world it is possible to return to the unique, we will have given back to God peace and security, the strength to recompose himself in his own center, the energy to resume the rhythm of his own breath. Her eyes were glistening, her complexion was as if warmed, her hands almost trembled, her voice had a heartbroken tone, and she seemed to be imploring buandolino also to believe in that revelation. Buandolino thought that perhaps the demiurge had made many errors, but the existence of this creature made the world an intoxicating place, sparkling with every perfection. He could not resist, he boldly took her hand and grazed it with a kiss. She made a kind of start, as if she had experienced something unknown. You, too, are inhabited by a god. Then she covered her face with her hands, and buandolino heard her murmur, stunned, I have lost. I have lost my apathy. She turned and ran towards the wood, without another word, without looking back. Master Nikitas, at that moment I realized that I loved as I had never loved, but again loving the one woman who could not be mine. One woman had been taken from me by the sublimity of her station, the other by the baseness of death. Now the third could not belong to me because she was dedicated to the salvation of God. I moved away, I went to the city, thinking that perhaps I should never return. I felt almost relieved the next day, when Praxias told me that, in the eyes of the inhabitants of Pindapedzum, I was surely the most authoritative of the magi. I enjoyed the confidence of the deacon, and I was the one the deacon wanted at the command of that army that the poet was now training so well. I couldn't evade that invitation. A rupture in the group of the magi would have made our situation untenable in the eyes of everyone, and all were by now so passionately devoting themselves to preparing for war, that I accepted, also so as not to disappoint the Sciapods, the Benotians, the Blemier, and all those other fine people of whom I had become sincerely fond. Above all, I thought that, in dedicating myself to this new venture, I would forget what I had left behind in the wood. For 2 days I was taken up with 1,000 duties. But as I worked hard, I was distracted, terrified by the idea that Hypatia might have come back to the lake and, not finding me there, would think that her flight had offended me, that I had decided never to see her again. I was distraught by the idea that she was distraught and wanted never to see me again. If that was so, I would have followed her trail, I would have ridden to the place where the Hypatias lived. What would I have done? I would have abducted her, I would have destroyed the peace of that community, making her understand what she could not understand, or else, no, would I have seen her intent on her mission, now free from her moment, her infinitesimal moment of earthly passion? But then, had that moment existed? I relived her every word, her every movement. Twice, to illustrate how God was, she had used our encounter as an example, but perhaps it was only her way, childish, innocent, of making what she was saying comprehensible to me. Twice she had touched me, but as she might have touched a sunflower. My mouth on her hand had made her tremble, I knew, but that was natural. No human mouth had ever grazed her, for her it had been like stumbling over a root and losing for an instant the composure she had been taught. The moment had passed, now she thought of it no more. With my friends I discussed war measures. I had to decide where to deploy the Nubians, and I didn't even understand where I was myself. I had to shake off that anguish, I had to know. For this, I had to put my life, and hers, in the hands of someone who would keep us in contact. I had already had ample proof of Gavagai's devotion. I spoke to him in secret, making him swear many oaths. I told him as little as possible, but enough for him to go to the lake and wait. The good skiapod was truly generous, wise, and discreet. He asked me little, I believe he understood much. For 2 days he returned at sunset to tell me he had seen no one, and he was saddened, seeing me turn pale. The third day he arrived with one of those smiles of his that looked like a crescent moon and told me that, while he was waiting, lying blissfully under the umbrella of his foot, that creature had appeared. She had confidently approached him, eager, as if she were expecting to see someone. With emotion she had received my message. She seems much to want to see you, Gavagai said, with a certain maliciousness in his voice, and made me understand that she would return to the lake every day, she said 2 times. Perhaps, Gavagai commented slyly, she too had long awaited the Magi. I had to remain in Pendapedzum the next day also, but I attended to my duties as general with an enthusiasm that amazed the poet, who knew how disinclined I was to arms, and I communicated the enthusiasm to my army. I seemed to be master of the world. I could have faced 100 white Huns without fear. 2 days later, I returned, trembling with fear, to that fateful place. 34. Buandolino discovers true love. In those days of waiting, Master Nikita's, I experienced conflicting emotions. I burned with the desire to see her. I feared I would never see her again. I imagined her prey to 1,000 dangers. In short, I felt all the sensations proper to love, but I did not feel jealousy. Didn't it occur to you that the mother could have sent her to the fecundators just at that time? That suspicion never crossed my mind. Perhaps, knowing to what extent I was now hers, I thought that she was so entirely mine that she would have refused to let others touch her. I pondered this at length, afterwards, and I was convinced that perfect love leaves no room for jealousy. Jealousy is suspicion, fear, and slander between lover and beloved, and St. John said that perfect love casts out all fear. I felt no jealousy, but at every moment I tried to summon up her face, and I failed. Yet, during our meetings, I had done nothing but stare at her face, nothing else. I have read that this is what happens when one feels intense love. Nikita said, with the embarrassment of a man who had perhaps never felt such an overwhelming passion. Hadn't that happened to you with Beatrice and with Calandrina? No, not in a way to make me suffer so. I believe that with Beatrice the first cultivated the very idea of love, which did not need a face, and to me it seemed then a sacrilege to make any effort to imagine her carnal features. As for Calandrina, I realized, after having known Hypatia, that with her it had not been passion, but rather, gaiety, tenderness, very intense affection. What I might have felt, God forgive me, for a daughter, or a younger sister. I believe it happens to all those who fall in love, but in those days I was convinced that Hypatia was the first woman I had truly loved, and certainly that is true, even now, and forever. I then learned that true love dwells in the triclinium of the heart, and finds there calm, alert to its own most noble secrets, and rarely returns to the chambers of the imagination. For this reason it cannot reproduce the corporeal form of the absent beloved. It is only love of fornication, which never enters the sanctum of the heart, and feeds only on voluptuous fantasies, that manages to reproduce such images. Nikita's remained silent, controlling, with some effort, his envy. Their reunion was shy and touching. Her eyes shone with happiness, but she immediately, modestly lowered her gaze. They sat down on the grass. Acacios grazed peacefully nearby. The scent of the flowers around them was stronger than usual, and Buandolino was feeling as if he had barely touched some berk with his lips. He didn't dare speak, but he determined to do so because the intensity of that silence would have drawn him to some untoward action. He understood only then why he had heard that true lovers, at their first love meeting, turn pale, tremble, and are silent. It is because, since love dominates the realms of both nature and spirit, it attracts to itself all their forces, however it may move. Thus, when true lovers meet, love disturbs and almost petrifies all the functions of the body, both physical and spiritual. Whence the tongue refuses to speak, the eyes to see, the ears to hear, and every limb shirks its proper duty. This means that, when love delays too long in the depths of the heart, the body, deprived of strength, wastes away. But at a certain point the heart, in the impatience of the ardor it feels, almost casts out its passion, allowing the body to resume its usual functions. And then the lover speaks. So it is, Buandolino said, without explaining what he was feeling and what he was understanding, all the beautiful and terrible things you have told me of are what the first Hypatia has handed down to you. Oh, no, she said. I told you that our ancestresses fled, having forgotten everything Hypatia had taught them except the duty of knowledge. It is through meditation that we have increasingly discovered the truth. During all these thousands of years each of us has reflected on the world surrounding us, and on what she felt in her own spirit, and our awareness has been enriched day by day, and the task is not yet done. Perhaps in what I have told you there were things that my companions had not yet understood, but I have understood them, in trying to explain them to you. So each of us becomes wise, training her companions in what she feels, and, acting as teacher, she learns. Perhaps if you weren't here with me, I would not have clarified certain things to myself. You have been my demon, my beneficent archon, Buandolino. But are all your companions as clear and eloquent as you, my sweet Hypatia? Oh, I am the least of them. Sometimes they tease me because I can't express what I feel. I still have to grow, you see. But these days I have felt proud, as if I possess a secret they don't know, and, I can't say why, I prefer to remain secret. I don't really understand what is happening to me, it's as if I preferred to say things to you rather than to them. Do you think this is bad, that I am untrue to them? You're true to me. With you it's easy. I think that with you I'd say everything that passes through my heart. Even if I weren't yet sure it is right. You know what has happened to me, buandolino, in these days? I have dreamed of you. When I woke in the morning, I thought it was a beautiful day because you were somewhere. Then I thought the day was bad because I didn't see you. It's strange. We laugh when we are happy, we weep when we suffer, and now I laugh and I weep at the same moment. Can I be ill? Yet it is a very beautiful illness. Is it right to love one's own illness? You are my teacher, my sweet friend. Buandolino smiled. You mustn't ask me, also because I believe I have your same illness. Hypatia reached out and again lightly touched his scar. You must be a good thing, buandolino, because I like to touch you, as I like to touch Acacios. Touch me, too. Perhaps you can waken some spark that is still in me, that I don't know. No, my sweet love. I'm afraid of hurting you. Touch me here, behind my ear. Yes, like that, again. Perhaps, through you, something good can be called up. You must have somewhere the mark that binds you to something else. She put his hands under her dress, she ran her fingers over the hair on his chest. She moved closer, to nuzzle him. You are filled with grass, good grass, she said. Then she said further. How beautiful you are underneath here, soft like a young animal. Are you young? I don't understand the age of a man. Are you young? I am young, my love, I am just born. He was now stroking her hair and almost with violence he placed his hands behind her nape. She began giving him little flicks of her tongue on his face, licking him as if he were a kid. Then she laughed, looking closely into his eyes, and said he tasted of salt. Buandolino had never been a saint. He pressed her against himself and sought her lips with his. She emitted a moan of fear and surprise, tried to withdraw, then yielded. Her mouth tasted of peaches, apricots, and with her tongue she gave his tongue little jabs, as she tasted it for the first time. Buandolino thrust her away, not out of virtue, but to free himself of what was covering him. She saw his member, touched it with her fingers, felt that it was alive and said that she wanted it. Clearly she didn't know how or why she wanted it, but some power of the woods or the streams was prompting her, telling her what she should do. Buandolino resumed covering her with kisses, moving from her lips to her neck, then her shoulders, while he slowly slipped off her robe, baring her breasts, plunged his face between them, and with his hands continued slipping the robe down over her hips. He felt the taut little belly, he touched her navel, felt, before he was expecting it, the soft down that concealed her supreme boon. She was whispering, calling him, my Eon, my tyrant, my abyss, my